Before we get started with today's episode, that this is part 2 of a 2-part episode. So if you haven't listened to part 1 of the Austen Servant Girl Annihilators, you should probably go back and do that now. Otherwise, everything we say today is not going to make a whole lot of sense.
Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurelis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife, Leah, as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laurelis was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and co-workers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement Podcast and Justice for Leon Laurelis. And now you can also find us on YouTube. Hello, Box in the Basement listeners. We want to bring awareness that September 25th is National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims. It's a day to remember the precious lives of those lost to homicide, to support their survivors. And here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on those lesser-known cases. We hope you share our episode so that we may reach more people in the hopes that someone listening may have some information that could be of value to the case. So let's make this September the year our listeners make a difference. Let's remember that everyone is loved. No one's past struggles makes anyone's lives less valuable. Last episode, we left off right after the arrest of the husbands of the final 2 victims. But let's do a quick recap. In December of 1884, the brutal murder of housekeeper Molly Smith in her own home in Austin, then a small town of 11,000 people, sent shockwaves through the public. Molly had been dragged from the bed she shared with her partner, sexually assaulted, hit in the head with an axe, and stabbed with a second sharp object. Over the course of the next year, 6 more women and 1 man were killed in a similar fashion, with some variations in weapons and methodology. Eliza Shelley was killed on May 6, 1885. Irene Cross was killed by a man with a knife on May 22nd. 11-year-old Mary Ramsey and her mother were attacked on August 13th. Though Mary's mother would ultimately survive, Gracie Vance and her partner, Orange Washington, were bludgeoned to death on September 28th. And Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were killed a mile and an hour apart on Christmas Eve of 1885. Several other women who worked as household staff were attacked and survived over the course of the year as well. Molly Smith's boyfriend was arrested for her murder, but the state couldn't make a case. Same for Susan Hancock's husband. Eula Smith's husband was actually convicted of her murder, but that would eventually be overturned on appeal.
So that brings us up to speed. So we left you with the question last time, who was the Austin axe murderer? The servant girl annihilator, the Austin Ripper, the midnight assassin, however you want to refer to him. Let's get into a few theories and suspects. First, let's back up a little bit and talk about evidence and eyewitnesses. Yes, this was the Victorian era, and criminology and forensics were rudimentary at best. But one of the creepiest parts about this entire series of events is that seemingly nobody got a good look at this guy. He murdered 8 people and attacked numerous others who lived, but the only person able to give a decent description was Irene Cross's nephew Douglas, who described his aunt's assailant as a heavy-set, barefoot black man. Keep in mind, however, that Douglas was a kid. It was the middle of the night, and Austin's city streets were not yet electrified. And eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable, mostly due to factors like the ones I just listed. There were other eyewitnesses along the way who described this attacker as being black, white, a light-complected black man, a, quote, yellow man, someone with his face painted black, a man in a dress, a man wearing a hat that concealed his face, and a man using a rag or handkerchief to cover part of his face. Some people said he acted alone, others described him as having one or more accomplices. So it's no wonder that Austin police arrested almost 400 different men over the course of the year. They literally had nothing to go on.
We're going to talk about 2 main suspects, and then a couple alternate theories. The first suspect is, in my opinion, the one that makes the most sense. Nathan Elgin was a 19-year-old cook who worked close to where all the attacks took place. Nathan grew up in Austin. He knew the roads, the businesses, the back alleys, and most importantly, the people and their habits. He moved with ease through the city. He was black, worked as a domestic employee from childhood, and was likable and easygoing on the surface, at least as a child. But as Nathan got older, he began to get violent and act out. There is some speculation that he experienced some form of physical abuse as a child, possibly at the hands of a stepmother or other female authority figures, and this possibly led to his angry disposition. In 1881, at the age of 15, Nathan was arrested for the first time for carrying a gun and getting into a fight with another young man. 2 teenagers acting a fool on the street wasn't uncommon in any city at that time, but this confrontation was serious enough to warrant police intervention. Lots of yelling started to annoy the neighbors. A year later, Nathan was on the police blotter again for sending a threatening letter to a Travis County Sheriff's deputy. In 1884, several months before the murder of Molly Smith, 2 black women were attacked with a knife while sleeping in their beds. A month later, another black woman was attacked while she slept with a blunt object. All 3 women survived, and the incidents were investigated separately. There was no reason to think at the time that they might be related. Again, you'll have to consider the social context at the time. Several attacks of a violent nature just weren't yet part of the cultural landscape. They existed, sure, but the concept simply wasn't part of the collective consciousness yet. Even now, we aren't sure that Nathan Elgin or whoever the Austin Axe murderer was is responsible for these crimes in 1884, but it is worth considering. A fourth woman, a live-in housekeeper, was attacked in November of 1884, but this one didn't even make the local news. Then came the December attack on Molly Smith and her boyfriend Walter. Over the next year, one of the only pieces of unique physical evidence that ever came out of this series of gruesome attacks was a set of bloody bare footprints. And that will become important momentarily. The last two murders attributed to the Austin Axe murder happened in December of 1885. To me, this is the most compelling information that makes me believe that Nathan was responsible. Nathan was confronted in January of 1886 outside of a saloon in Austin after attempting to kidnap a young woman at knife point. He was barefoot, as he often was. The police were called, and several officers attempted to subdue Nathan and take him into custody. Nathan slipped out of their grasp and lunged at them with his knife. One of the officers shot Nathan, and he died the following day. Two important things here. One of the officers shot Nathan, and he died the following day. Two important things here. The axe murders and attacks on domestic servants stopped after Nathan Elgin was killed. Also, investigators noted that Nathan was missing part of a toe, which aligned with the bloody footprints left behind at Eliza Shelley's home. I realize that's a little thin. Comparing bloody footprints in the Victorian era wasn't an exact science, but it does seem a bit coincidental, especially given the murders stopped after Nathan died.
The next suspect is a man we only know as Maurice, who was of Malaysian descent. He was also a cook, and he worked at a place called the Pearl House Hotel in Austin. Almost all the victims of the Austin Axe murderer were connected to the Pearl House in some way. I can't find a whole lot on the specifics of what all these connections were, but this isn't altogether convincing to me. In 1885, Austin had a population of about 11,000 people. That is pretty small, even in a day before cars and mass transit existed. There were probably a lot of people in Austin who had a connection to that hotel. Employee, a relative of an employee, a customer, a delivery person, you name it. Hotels weren't just for visitors in those days, they were places to eat, drink, and socialize. That being said, a hotel might be the perfect place as a serial killer to stalk or pick out potential victims, particularly if they were locals. Timing was also an interesting issue here. Maurice left Austin shortly after the last murders. He moved to New Orleans and then eventually to London, and that's a bit of foreshadowing for one of our alternate theories.
There is some speculation that these murders weren't connected, or that only some of them were connected. Perhaps two or three, and then the rest were copycats or a different perpetrator altogether. I think there is some merit to that theory. Law enforcement and city officials at the time were split on the issue. Some believed the attacks, or at least the murders, were all carried out by the same person, but some were adamant that it simply wasn't possible. Whether that was a matter of evidence and investigation or an artifact of the pre-serial killer mindset, we can't say for sure. It could also be a matter of saving face through denial. Austin was a safe city, a city on the way up. Nobody wanted to admit its residents might be unsafe. At the same time, though, Austin was relatively safe. It was also growing and expanding quickly. New faces were showing up looking for work and or a fresh start from all over. It's not out of the realm of possibility that several nefarious characters popped up in Austin during that time. The patterns of the attacks were all similar. Someone would break into living quarters and attack the victim or victims while they slept. But the same murder weapon wasn't used in every attack. Sometimes an axe was used. Sometimes a knife was used. Sometimes both. In one instance, remember the attacker used a gun and shot his intended victim through a window. It is possible that some of these attacks were perpetrated by different people. At the same time, I do tend to believe at least 6 of the actual murders were committed by the same person because of one particular detail. In 6 of the killings, the victim was impaled with a metal object through the skull. Some sources describe it as an iron rod, some as simply a thin metal object. That seems particularly brutal and deranged, and sounds like something you'd read about in a more modern account of a serial killer.
I tend to agree with you. The only one I'm on the fence about was the final murderer, Eula Phillips. I've seen some theories that both Eula's husband Jimmy and Susan Hancock's husband Moses had been following the axe murderers in the media and maybe staged copycat murders. It just seems like an absolutely incredible coincidence that they'd happen on the same night just a mile apart. Susan Hancock's skull was impaled by a metal rod, which leads me to believe that she was an actual victim of the axe murderer. As far as I can tell, Eula Phillips did not suffer the same fate. Furthermore, she was pinned down and raped, which was a change in tactics. The killer had raped before, but never resorted to pinning down his victim to the ground.
Eula's husband Jimmy had a significant head injury, and some articles state that he was in and out of consciousness that night. While I do find it hard to believe he could inflict that severe an injury to himself, I don't think it's completely out of the question. We kind of touched on murderers who self-inflicted injuries earlier to avoid suspicion. Jeffrey McDonald, the Army captain convicted of killing his family at Fort Bragg, is the first one that comes to mind. He reportedly stabbed himself in the chest and had a concussion. Sam Shepard eventually won on appeal, but he was initially convicted of killing his wife. He also had a concussion and a neck injury. Richard Speck had self-inflicted injuries. Jimmy Phillips also had a motive, means, and opportunity to kill his young wife. She was killed after attempting to sneak out and meet up with another man. Jimmy was prone to violence and rage. But though Jimmy was initially convicted of his wife's murder, he was eventually exonerated. Still, that's the one that sticks in my head as the possible outlier. Again, though, the extreme coincidence of it happening on the same night as another axe murder around the corner is crazy to me. I'm conflicted.
The final theory we're going to discuss is the most sensational one, which is why we saved it for last. And that is that the Austin axe murderer is also Jack the Ripper. We won't go into great detail as far as the crimes are concerned because that could be a 10-part episode in and of itself, but there are some aspects of the Jack Ripper cases that warrant mentioning this possible connection. So, real quick overview, Jack the Ripper was a serial killer in the East End of London between August and November of 1888. He was also known as Leather Apron and the Whitechapel Murderer. According to canon, Jack the Ripper is responsible for 5 murders. that of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All of the women were sex workers, and the Whitechapel section of London was notorious for being desperately poor, overcrowded, and riddled with violence. The Whitechapel parish had over 80,000 residents by 1888 due to an influx of refugees escaping ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe and Russia, and also immigrants from Ireland. Anti-Semitism, hate for immigrants, racism, poverty, sickness, and lack of housing made this a perfect storm for crime, and it would have been an ideal hunting ground for some depraved serial killer. If you've done any kind of research on Jack the Ripper, you know that there are far more than 5 people thought to be possible victims, but the 5 I mentioned are the ones most definitively linked to a single killer. There are some things that make this connection a possibility. The murders in London started up after the murders in Austin stopped. The last Austin murders were at the end of December 1885, and the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper started in late summer of 1888. You might think that nearly 3 years is a long cooling-off period for a killer who rarely went more than a few months between murders in Austin, and that's a fair point. But you have to consider the time period. You couldn't just pull up the Delta app, book a plane ticket, hop on a transatlantic flight that evening, and be in London in time for lunch. In the 1880s, transatlantic travel was done by sea, typically on a steamship, and the voyage usually took a week to 10 days. At that point in time, there were usually ships leaving U.S. ports several times a week to make the voyage, but tickets were expensive, and you had to get to a port with a ship scheduled in order to book a ticket. It would take days or even weeks to travel to an appropriate port. At the time, there were only a few with transatlantic bookings, and the closest to Austin would have been New Orleans. It's entirely plausible that if the Austin axe murderer and Jack the Ripper are one and the same, the perpetrator slowly made his way to a port, earning money and covering his tracks as he went. If he lived other places in the US or Europe prior to 1888, there could be unsolved murders in those locations we haven't connected yet. I've seen some amateur true crime researchers like myself try to tie a group of murders across Texas, the South, and up the East Coast to the Austin axe murderer, but it's just hard to say. There's not a whole lot of information, and the evidence we have is sketchy at best. It's also possible that the killer simply stopped for a time. Perhaps he felt the police were getting too close, and he simply moved away and laid low. BTK laid low for 13 years between 2 of his killings? Remember earlier when we discussed the possible suspect named Maurice, the cook? He left Austin after the final murders, spent time in New Orleans where there was a regular transatlantic passenger route, and then made his way to London. That is one of the many coincidences that kind of prompted the comparison here. So the timing is one major tie-in, but the victimology and the methodology of Jack the Ripper were very different from Austin. And those are the main reasons I doubt they are the same person. In Austin, the victims were mostly domestic employees, cooks and housekeepers. Many of them lived on the property of their employers, but not all. Many were black, but some of the victims who were attacked and not killed were white. Jack the Ripper, on the other hand, targeted sex workers, not servants. Austin, despite lauding itself as more academic and progressive than its more frontier-oriented counterparts, had plenty of sex workers of all races. There was a red light district, there were plenty of brothels, and saloons employed sex workers under the table. Likewise, London in 1888 would have had a plethora of households that employed domestic workers. London's metro area had a population of just under 5 million people in 1888. To explain this shift, if the killers were the same person, I think it's a matter of access. Austin was small, it was more spread out, less densely populated, and it was simply easier for the perpetrator to attack people in residential areas. In London, especially the Whitechapel parish, it would have been easier to target sex workers who were frequently out and about on the streets at night. The other big difference is how the victims were attacked and killed. In Austin, the victims were hit with an axe, stabbed with a knife, and/or beaten with blunt objects. One case involved a gun, but that seems to be the outlier. 6 of the murder victims were impaled through the skull with a metal rod. In the case of Jack the Ripper, the 5 canonical victims, at least, were subjected to far different and frankly far more fucked up injuries. These injuries included slashed throats, abdomens ripped open with a knife, removal of internal organs, and mutilation. That's not to say that the Austin axe murderer's methods didn't evolve if and when he made the jump to Europe, but it does make it seem more likely that these were 2 entirely different people. We kind of get stuck in this mindset that serial killers have certain methods or calling cards that never change, but that's an incorrect assumption. There are plenty of examples throughout history where serial killers have changed murder weapons or victimology or methods as they get more confident or as a way to deter law enforcement, keep the heat off of them. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, comes to mind. He initially killed sex workers, and then he started killing women who weren't sex workers. Israel Keyes is another big one. So was Jack the Ripper the Austin axe murderer? I don't know, I can't say for sure, though it is kind of a fun thought exercise. I have my serious doubts, but we did think it was significant enough to bring it up here.
Just like with H.H. Holmes and all the other people thought to be Jack the Ripper, I find the connections dubious at best. Like you said, there are some coincidence and interesting parallels, but to me, especially at that time, the logistics and the changes in methods and MO seem to be too much. We look at these problems through our 2025 eyes. We have cars and debit cards and cell phones. Hell, we have electric street lights. I think you have to make too many assumptions and engage in too many mental gymnastics to make those theories work. I'm going with Occam's razor here. The simplest explanation is probably the right one, and in my opinion, it was probably Nathan Algen or the other suspected cook. They had access, they had means, and they had opportunity. Motive is probably one of those things we'll never know, even if we do figure out who the Austin axe murderer or Jack the Ripper actually were.
Thank you so much for joining us today and on our last episode. This case was incredible to research, and I hope y'all like it, because we'd like to bring you more historical true crime in the future.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. If you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options. Visit victimconnect.org to learn more. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com.
Do you like history, but want to learn something new?
You mean something old? Like pre-1900s old?
Yeah, that.
Remember the episode about murder?
Which one? There were a lot of them.
Or all the forgotten women in history that are actually pretty awesome?
How about all those cannibalism episodes?
No.
If any of this has sparked your interest, then you should join us every Wednesday for new episodes of Ye Olde Crime.
It's the show where Lindsay and I discuss funny, strange, and obscure crimes with some paranormal stuff sprinkled in. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And we'll see you next time with another tale
as old as crime.
If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurelis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurelis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. This podcast has a bigger purpose than just providing information and entertainment. The Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act is a bipartisan bill that was signed into law by Congress in 2021, and we want to see it put into action. This law establishes a systematic process for reviewing case files related to cold case murders. So let's remember that everyone is loved. No one's past struggles makes anyone's lives less valuable. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.